I'm in Africana and American Indian Studies at Cal State Fresno, and I'm a research associate here at the Institute of Signifying Scriptures. I'd like to welcome you back on behalf of the Institute to the session 4, Scriptures as Sundials in African American Lives. The session will commence with a short introduction of the research team by Robin Owens, soon to be Dr. Robin Owens. Following this opening, panelists will spend an hour and a half sharing their research. The session will conclude with 30 minutes of discussion, hopefully a chance for us to dialogue, and please no throwing or fighting in this session. All right.
Hello, I'm Robin Owens, a research assistant at the Institute for Signifying Scriptures. Again, welcome to Scriptures as Sundials in African American Lives. In the following session, a panel of 3 presenters will report on the African American component of the Ethnologies of Scripture project. Ethnographic research was conducted in Tallahassee, Florida, Atlanta, Georgia, and New York, New York. Velma Love, Director, is Assistant Professor of Religion at Florida A&M University in Tallahassee. She conducted ethnographic research in Tallahassee, Florida. Dr. Love has been an ISS affiliate since its inception at CGU and in his previous life as the African Americans in the Bible Project at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Her current research work is on mythology, the Ifa/Orisha tradition, and the polytheistic aspects of the human psyche. Renee Harrison, Research Associate, conducted ISS research in Atlanta, Georgia. She is currently Assistant Professor of African American Religious Practices and Culture at Payne Theological Seminary in Wilberforce, Ohio. She recently completed a Lilly Endowment postdoc in Practical Theology and Religious Practices at Emory University. Her work focuses on spirituality and religious practices of healing in West African and African American cultures. Dr. Harrison just published a book entitled Enslaved Women and the Art of Resistance in Antebellum America. Dr. Jackson, Research Associate, is a documentary filmmaker. Dr. Jackson is Richard Perry University Professor of Communication and Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he also serves as Associate Dean of Undergraduate Studies at the Annenberg School of Communication. He is currently completing an ethnography of global Black Hebrewism, along with a documentary about Rastafarian responses to violence in contemporary Jamaica. Join me again in welcoming the panel, Scriptures as Sundials in African American Lives. Thank you, Robin. It's good to be here and to be a part of this ongoing conversation about scriptures and scripturalizing practices. Our goal is to keep you awake, okay? And we need your cooperation in meeting this goal. Okay, we'll do our part. Thank you to Professor Wimbush and the conference staff for all of the time and energy you devoted to bringing us here. I know a little something about that. While this conference is the culminating event of a 3-year research project, for me, this is part of a journey that began many years ago in rural South Carolina, where I grew up as a young child, fascinated with stories. That fascination continues and has followed me. So as part of this presentation, we are going to share some stories. Personal and public narratives from the lives of participants who graciously consented to be a part of this project. These narratives, some historical, some contemporary, do not in any way represent the full range of African American engagements with scriptures, but they do represent something of the social function of scriptures, and as such, we have entitled this presentation, Scriptures as Sundials in African American Lives. A sundial, as you know, is an ancient instrument by which people
tell the time of day, and order their lives. From a beam of sunlight casting a shadow on the dial, the reader gains environmental information useful in scheduling activities and in organizing the day. Scriptures function somewhat the same way. The scriptures of a people say something about the social environment of a people, and it in some way tells what time of day it is in terms of social and emotional political climate. As Wesley Court reminds us, because the texts that constitute a person's scriptures are primary for the world they support, those texts hold the potential to sustain or reconfigure that world when it has been in part disconfirmed or at points found to be unsatisfactory or unworkable. This study explores some of the ways in which the texts have become scriptures, the texts that have become scriptures in African American lives have functioned to sustain or reconfigure worlds. And in some cases, when those scriptures are no longer found to be sustaining, they have been abandoned or reconfigured. Guided by Charles Long's 3 perspectives for the study of African American religion, being Africa as historical reality and religious image, involuntary presence in America, and the experience and symbol of God, our goal is to shed light on the social functioning of scriptures in African American life. In pursuit of this goal, we look at sacred story as expressed in personal and public narrative, as well as in the expressive arts, beginning with an historical overview that helps situate African American orientations. We continue with the weaving of a thematic tapestry that reflects an improvisational and adaptive response to the abrupt removal of a people from their cultural land. These diverse and intense efforts to repair a torn cultural landscape are informed by scriptures, sometimes oral, sometimes written, sometimes embodied, in the lives of those whose social identity started as African and through various mutations became colored, Negro, Black, Afro-American, and African American. This study then examines African American scriptural orientations through a mixed method multi-site research design, including qualitative interviews, focus groups, participant observation, and document analysis. Additional data comes from John Jackson's perennial research. He's followed the Black Hebrew Israelites around the globe. The U.S. population sample included college and seminary students, unaffiliated individuals, as well as members of local community religious organizations, including the Tallahassee and Atlanta chapters of the African Hebrew Israelites and several local churches. The ethnographic data collected included transcripts from 15 interviews, 8 men and 7 women, ranging in age from 21 to 60, and 4 focus groups, each composed of from 5 to 12 college and seminary students, ranging in age from 19 to 40, for a total of 31 focus group participants. Participant observer researchers also gathered data by attending study groups, meetings, worship services, festivals, and analyzing primary source documents available from sponsoring organizations. The life story interview provided an opportunity for participants to tell their stories, and by self-report, provide a window into the development of a religious consciousness that reflects worldview and self-understanding. The life story itself becomes a sacred text, and the researcher begins to see the archetypal patterns, themes, and motifs of a larger human story reflected in the individual life as reported. Now I want to hasten on to move on to say a bit about the historical backdrop against which this work plays out. As historians of religion, Vincent Wimbush and Charles Long both suggest, we begin with Africa as the point of departure. Scholars of African culture tell us that in the African mind, sacred energy infuses all things. Wisdom is elemental and radiates from the one consciousness through all and in all. How strange it must have seemed when the missionary invaders came with their holy book, insisting that it and it alone was the source of sacred knowledge. It was from this awareness and these precepts that many enslaved Africans were forcefully taken. Who can know their thoughts during that long, nightmarish journey, that enduring dark night of liminal space between home and strange new world? In his gifted use of poetic language, Howard Thurman shares the musings he penned in a journal during his first trip to Africa.
From my cabin window, I look out on the full moon and the ghosts of my forefathers, and fall with undulating waves. Across these same waters, how many years ago they came? What were the inchoate mutterings locked tight within the circle of their hearts? In the deep, heavy darkness of that foul-smelling hole of the ship, where they could not see the sky, could not hear the night noises, nor feel the warm companion of the tribe. They held their breath against the agony. How does the human spirit accommodate itself to desolation? How did they? What tools of the spirit were in their hands with which to cut a path through the wilderness of their despair? If only death of the body could come to deliver the soul from dying. There were no gods to hear, no magic spell of witch doctor to summon. Even one's companion in chains muttered his quivering misery in a tongue unknown and a sound unfamiliar. Oh, my fathers, what was it like to be stripped of all support of life, save the beating of the heart and the ebb and flow of fetid air in the lungs? In a strange moment when you suddenly caught your breath, did some intimation from the future give your spirit a wink of promise? In the darkness, did you hear the silent feet of your children beating a melody of freedom to words which you would never know, in a land which your bones would be warmed again and against in the depths of the cold earth in which you sleep, unknown, unrealized, and alone?
In these words, Thurman captures well the questions raised by the descendants of the first Africans. How does the human spirit accommodate itself to desolation? How did they? What tools of the spirit were in their hands with which to cut a path through the wilderness of their despair? Their embodied memories became tools of the spirit, and over time they fashioned for themselves new scriptures and new languages from which to create for themselves a world anew. And now we tell the story in image and sound.
God, when I was alone and had nothing, I asked for a friend to help me bear the pain. No one came except God. When I needed a breath to rise from my sleep, no one could help me except God. When all I saw was sadness and I needed answers, no one heard me except God. So when I'm asked who I give my unconditional love to, look for no other name except God.
world tries to connect with the technology in 2009. Something to learn from for today. Yes. Can you hear me? Is that better? I apologize for the technical difficulties. Historians of religion scholar Vincent Harding likens the black struggle for freedom in America to a river. Harding writes, "It is a long, continuous movement flowing like a river, sometimes powerful, tumultuous, and rolling with life, at other times meandering, covered with the ice and snow of seemingly endless winters, all too often streaked and running with blood. There is something," Harding writes, "about its apparent inactness and ambiguity. And yet, with the passing of time and the deepening of our vision, it is possible to recognize that we are indeed the river. And at the same time, the river is more than us, generations more, millions more." Through such an opening, he writes, we may sense that the river of the black struggle is people. But it is also the hope, the movement, the transformative power that humans create and that creates them us and makes them us new persons. So we black people are the river. The river is us. The river is in us, created by us, flowing out of us, surrounding us, recreating us, and this entire nation. The dynamics and justice of its movement have continuously gathered others to itself, have persistently filled other men and women with the force of its vision, its hope. And at its best, the river of our struggle has moved constantly towards the ocean of humankind's most courageous hopes for freedom and integrity, forever seeking what black people in South Carolina said they sought in 1865, simply the right to develop our whole human being. Harding's words vibrate with such fluidity, movement, and grace. It is his metaphor that bids us all to step with time into Kairos and wade in its waters, to feel, see, smell, touch, and taste the depths of the black struggle and hope for freedom, self-expression, and justice in America. Such waiting awakens us to the reality that neither the black experience nor its faith expressions is a monolithic, static one. As the PowerPoint and the research of this group has shown, it has been and continues to be a dynamic, complex, multivalent tributary, many streams emerging from various contexts of struggle, faith, joy, and freedom. Historically, black peoples have sustained and participated in a variety of faith traditions. It was such diversity that led anthropologist and folklorist Zora Neale Hurston, upon interviewing blacks following the Great Depression, to record in her field notes that the Negro is not a Christian really. Yet although the black religious experience in America is diverse and extends beyond the normative Christian gauge, what I found striking while conducting ISS field research in Atlanta and also compiling the PowerPoint photos for today's presentations were those organisms in the water which appeared strange and oppositional, contradictory to the river's current. The complex irony, for example, of Ray Charles' Beautiful America, in contrast to the grotesquerie of lynching and water hoses. The complex irony of an array of sacred texts within the black community overshadowed by a Protestant language world. The complex irony of fluid religious expressions within the foreground of a fixed idea as expressed by the Harmony Baptist Church's marquee, "A free thinker is Satan's slave." A free thinker is Satan's slave. That particular photo was taken during field research on August 23, 2008 in Polk County, Georgia. A teenager was conducting research as well for a high school project. And immediately the photo was placed with commentary on the web on livejournal.com, and within days, bloggers from around the world responding, leaving two interpretations of the black evangelicals' marquees dominating the airwaves. And these were the two dominant interpretations. One is open, I quote, one is open to evil if one is open to new ideas. And second, if one does not accept or hold firm to biblical literalism, one is bound for hell. The Marquis statement, which was visible from the highway, suggests that free thinkers live antithetical to God. Those who stay contained within the river's imposed rigid boundaries are in compliance to God's will. Yet one must wonder what happens when this fundamentalist ideology meets the systemic and historical realities of race, class, gender, and religious-cultural oppressions, as well as heterosexism and homophobia. In what ways is the Bible or any sacred text interpreted in light of these realities? How does the river then really see itself? Such became the focus during my field research in Atlanta and subsequently outside the purview of this ISS study in Wilberforce, Ohio. A research assistant, along with myself, Marlee Farley, gathered ISS focus groups to explore the importance of Scripture in the African American community, and in this case, a targeted group of African American seminarian students at Candler School of Theology. Seminary students were selected for this study primarily because they represent a unique demographic of the African American Christian community. They are a cusp between lay person and lay leader and ordained clergy. They are a cusp between the church and the academy, and at a place where they feel book learning, as they quote, will cause them to lose their burning. They are at a place where they struggle to hold firm to traditional values while simultaneously engaging colleagues from various ethnic groups and faith communities. Seminarians were also chosen because many enter seminary professing they know everything about God and soon discover and articulate that they really know nothing at all. They are also at two important junctures in their lives where they are searching for self and searching for meaning. During our final first focus group session on April 18, 2008 at 6 p.m. at Candler, I asked 4 African American students formerly engaged in the study to participate in a nonverbal activity. The 4 were affiliated with predominantly Black Baptist, non-denominational, AME, and Pentecostal churches in the Atlanta area. I asked the students to imagine a line between 2 walls. At one end, on the far left, were the words, "strongly agree." On the far right were the words, "strongly disagree." Some were advised to move along the pendulum and stand in the area. Students were advised to move along the pendulum and stand in the area that best represented their response to the questions. The middle represented a synthesis between the two, strongly agree and strongly disagree. Each student's response was identified by their initials, CW, RM, CS, and JB. But for the purpose of today, I'm going to request that you listen to the question and the responses from RM. So RM's responses as I address the questions. Question 1. When I was growing up, I was taught that the Bible was the infallible Word of God. The response, all students stand beneath the strongly agree sign. Question 2, the Bible nor any other sacred text had an influence on my life while I was growing up. Strongly, they all stand under strongly disagree. Question 3, a literal interpretation of the Bible does not make sense in the modern world. 2 stand in the middle, and RM and another stand in the strongly disagree area. College, seminary, theology school has had no impact on the way I read and interpret the Bible or any other sacred text. All participants stand in the middle. I believe today that the Bible is the infallible Word of God. RM stands in the strongly agree section. All others stand midway. I agree with everything that's in the biblical text, and the Bible is sacred. RM stands in the strongly agree section. Others stand in different areas along the pendulum. I believe that the Bible is the inspired Word of God. All participants stand in the strongly agree section. I believe the Bible is a sacred text. They all stand in the strongly agree section. I posed these questions in different ways to see if it would cause them to move, but they, for the most part, stayed with what they were consistent with from the beginning. What, if anything, do you find confusing about the Bible or any other sacred text as a guide for living? Now we're verbally having a conversation. RM responds, I don't find anything confusing. I guess because I don't see any other text as being sacred, as leading one to the right path. I think it would become an issue for me with being concerned with the salvation of those who choose to follow texts that aren't truth. So then I respond, so do you see the Bible as sacred? Yes, he responds. But other sacred texts not sacred? Yes, he responds. We continue with the discussion on the Bible as a guide and as an absolute truth, as they quote, for living. A question is posed regarding if we employ a literalist read of the text, meaning it's sacred, absolute, and infallible, how does one interpret the text in light of these social and historical realities around them? Students are then asked to consider a present-day social dilemma impacting the African American community to answer their questions. It's silence for a while, and then CW raises the first social dilemma. She states, silence in a way is agreement. So I ponder, what do you mean? Well, those who are silent about homosexuality are in agreement with homosexuality. It is a sin. But it's also a sin for people to not say anything against it. And it's also a sin to denigrate, harass, kill, or maim people because of their sexual preference. I then direct their attention to the Hamite curse and inquire whether or not they see blackness as a sin. RM immediately says no. CS deflects by locating the problem in the interpreter and not the biblical text. RM then interjects, drawing on Old Testament and New Testament scriptures. He states, when Ezekiel was in exile, the people asked him if they were required to pay for the sins of their fathers, and the prophet told them no, once the new covenant is made. And so with the Hamite agreement and argument, if it was supposedly a sin at one time, it's been done away with because Christ has come. I'll stop there. This sense of deflecting on the part of RM by appropriating Bible talk or Jesus language, as well as this eraser of the black self by accepting blackness as a sin prior to the new covenant, and the prioritizing of scripture points to the ways, or one of the ways, Vincent Wimbush identifies how blacks have engaged the biblical text. In his work, African Americans and the Bible, Wimbush creates an imaginary circle with Africa at the center. Along this circle, he identifies 5 phases of African Americans' biblical reading. A reading in which African Americans encountered, interpreted, and linked the language world of the Bible to their own social historical experiences. However, in one of the 5 phases or readings, this linking does not occur. Something distinctly different emerges. This distinction leads Wimbush to argue that in this 5th phase or reading, African Americans step outside the circle by adopting a fundamentalist ideology which adheres to the authority of the Bible, making it a de-racialized, depoliticized, and universal guide to truth and salvation. Religious truth, Wimbush argues, can now be claimed to have transcended historical experience, and the Bible becomes a weapon in a broad criticism of African American culture. We see this emerging with RM's statement, wherein RM not only views blackness as a sin, but separates himself from the supposedly sins of the past, and those sins were supposedly committed by his forebears. According to Wimbush, this step outside the circle, or what I raise here as a troubling of our waters, did not appear in African American culture in significant numbers until the 1940s and 50s, signifying what he terms as a crisis of thinking or of security. I agree with Winbush about this crisis and the significance of this phenomenon during the 1940s and 50s. Yet what I found both troubling and intriguing are the similarities between the ISS interviews conducted with seminary students just last year and the slave narratives. In my own research, while mining for life-affirming strategies of resistance and healing to violence that were employed by enslaved women under the constant threat of lawful domestic terrorism, I could no longer ignore the narratives which did not counter the hegemonic language world of Euro-American Christian culture. That is to say, some former enslaved women and men during the antebellum period articulated the same sentiments as expressed by Black fundamentalists in the 1940s and 50s and the Harmony Baptist Church's Marquis and ISS groups in the 21st century. Sentiments which I term in my work as self-violence, wherein the slave community internalized non-affirming ideologies and perceptions about their Africanness. That is, their very humanity, ethnicity, their own ancestral place of origin, and traditional cultural philosophies and religion. Such internalization resulted in a negation or an eraser of the self and spiritual fragmentation, creating in the African American psyche misguided notions about salvation, which was further damaged by self-debasing conversion experiences and miseducation of the Negro. Many shared the same sentiments as expressed by a former enslaved man who stated simply, slavery in this country, taking everything into consideration, was a godsend. The 20 million Negroes are descendants from 4 million sent over from Africa. If it had not been for the slave traffic, we would still be living in Africa. I would be a heathen and my children would be heathens. Out of bad comes good. Like him, there were slaves who also believed that formal education was a sin and foolishness because a true Christian was of the world but not in the world, I quote, and therefore one's focus should remain heaven-bound. As one former enslaved woman remarked, book learning, while good, is worldly and ain't got nothing to do with being born of God. Such ideologies are often interpreted of poor, illiterate Blacks, but what are we to make of Phyllis Wheatley and a host of others? Renowned 18th century poet Jennifer Hammer, for example, in an address to the Negroes in the state of New York stated, respecting obedience to masters, I am certain that while we are slaves, it is our duty to obey our masters, as Paul and Jesus have commanded. It is these narratives I could not ignore while conducting my own research. So what are we to make of all of this? Of RM statements, of the ISS interviews, of the Marquis from the Harmony Baptist Church? What are we to make of narratives which speak of non-life affirming ideas about being Black and being in America? What are we to make of this phenomenon existing from slavery to present? What are we to make of these strange and oppositional organisms in our waters? These organisms which Winbush argues have stepped outside the circle because they have seemingly swam inconsistent or against the current. What do we make of these organisms which seek to consciously or unconsciously deny their very own or our very own existence? What do we do? Perhaps we change our sight. From a womanist feminist view, we resist the othering dilemma, for they are not merely phenomenons who stepped outside the circle. They are indeed in the circle. They make up the circle. They are not merely organisms in the waters. They are indeed the river. reflecting, in some sense, mirroring our own strangeness and opposition, our own identity crisis and inner discord as we travel the waters and the terrain of America. They are indeed our interconnecting and conflicting streams, pressing through, gushing out, and moving forward. Perhaps seeking mergence into one river, one time, one Kairos. What do? We simply learn to let the rivers be, because all rivers eventually come home. Thank you.
And the river flows on. The grounded theory that emerged from the life story narratives of the interviewees served as a guide in the interpretation and analysis that began with the first interview and continued to unfold throughout the process. This theory suggests that every life story is a sacred story, and as such is in some way connected to a larger human story. Each story thus represents a view of self, a view of world, and something that connects the two, providing the individual with a sense of coherence. Our sample of African American life story narratives reflects a view of world as ranging from harsh, unfriendly, and corrupted to an energy matrix of exciting possibilities, and a view of self ranging from unworthy and inadequate to self as a divine expression of the infinite source. In what ways might African American readings of Scripture reflect also a reading of America? A quest for meaning, belonging, affirmation, and agency forms the backstory of all the data we gathered. The quest started early in life, for some as early as reciting Bible verses at the ages of 4 or 5, with no clue as to the meaning of purpose. With each personal narrative, we found themes, patterns, and motifs reflecting the psychological and social functions of the sacred story as lived out in the unique journey of the individual. We will use one story to highlight. I call this person Cynthia. Cynthia, a 55-year-old African-American woman, speaks.
My mother abandoned me when I was an infant. My mother abandoned me when I was an infant. I was raised by my grandmother, my father, and a lady in the community. When I was about 12 or 13, I went to church with my stepmother, and they did an altar call. She told me to go up and tell them that I wanted to be baptized. I just did what she said. I really didn't even know what that meant, but I did it anyway. Then at some point later on, this woman left my father. I remember waking up one morning and she was gone. Since my father did not go to church, I didn't have any more exposure to it until I was about 20. I was married then, and my sister-in-law invited me to go with her to a tent revival. She always had her Bible, and she was talking about the love of God and the love of Jesus, and I thought maybe she had found something that could help me. I didn't know what to do with my life. I was looking for direction and purpose and answers.
Cynthia went to a tent revival, and this represented a departure from her everyday life, a significant point in her search for purpose and direction. She described her journey as an intense search for understanding and knowledge.
So I went to this tent meeting, and when they did the altar call, I went up there, and when they were talking about how much Jesus loved me, I thought, surely this must be the answer. I cried uncontrollably because I felt like for the first time somebody really cared about me. My sister-in-law gave me a Bible, and that was the beginning for me. I had dropped out of high school. I couldn't even read. I taught myself to read by reading the Bible and looking up words in the dictionary that I didn't know. I found a lot of answers in the book of Proverbs. I translated everything into do's and don'ts. I was reading and studying all the time. I was on a mission to learn the truth and to apply it to my life.
Cynthia's dependence on the Bible as the source for meaning is echoed by the focus group participants, as well as other individuals whom we interviewed. Repeatedly, we heard that the Bible was the rule book and the ultimate authority on life. Cynthia's sentiments in many ways are echoed in the comments of the college students and seminarians. For example, I think that the Bible is a text that the Lord would have us to go back to time and time again, because everything that you may want or desire or need answers for is pretty much in the Bible. You need the Bible like you need water to survive. We continue with Cynthia's story.
My sister-in-law invited me to church with her, and I was so happy to see that so many people loved God, and I felt that I had found a place to go that lined up with what I felt inside. I remember being very dogmatic because I wanted to do what was right. I had to stay right in order to continue to have God's love and to have a better life. I read the Bible. I prayed and fasted for weeks at a time. I saw visions, and I became known as one with the gift of prophecy. I went from the Baptist church to the Holiness Church because prophecy was accepted there. At first, this felt like it was right for me, but I became a problem for them. I asked too many questions, and I would not accept their indoctrination.
By this time, Cynthia was a single parent, raising 2 daughters alone and, quote, trying not to sin against God, fearful of the consequences for herself and her children. Because she was taught that sex outside of marriage was an abomination before God, she entered into several short-lived, ill-advised marriages, twice to men in prison, because she believed so strongly in the power of forgiveness. She wanted to be the perfect Christian and not to be involved in worldly things, so much so that when she came home from work one day and saw that her daughters had decorated their bedroom with pictures of the Smurfs, she tore all the pictures off the wall and threw them into the trash, vowing that she would not have pictures of demons in her house. She was holding church in her apartment, and in her words, her place, her space, had to be pure.
My little house church and home Bible study didn't last long. Someone invited me to another church, and I decided I would try it. They had some sort of probationary membership where you would go to these study groups for 3 months, and then they would decide if you met their qualifications to join the church. At the end of my 3 months, they told me I could not continue because I had too much of my own mind, and I was not willing to submit to the pastor, who was the head of the church. As it turned out later on, I heard that the pastor was sleeping around with different women in the church, and it ended up being a huge sex scandal. A number of people left. I was happy that I had already left that church. I was still searching for answers, and I decided to go to Rhema Bible College in Oklahoma. But I did not find any answers there. In fact, it was just more the same. About 30 to 40% of the students there were black. We were all searching for something that would make our lives better. They taught the fivefold ministry and that the Bible was the infallible word of God. By this time, I was beginning to think something was terribly wrong. I found it very disappointing. There were students there living in their cars thinking they were doing the will of God. They didn't even have a place to live. When I graduated from Rhema, I was just about through with the church. But I thought maybe if I could learn more about the Hebrew culture, I could get some answers.
And the quest continued.
I first learned about Ben Hami's group through someone who knew I was searching for the truth of the scriptures from the Hebrew perspective. When I heard about the Hebrew Israelites, I thought I had found my answer. They had some of the Hebrew stuff and a lot of the black stuff. The music, the drumming, the emotion. I connected on a certain level, but after a while, it no longer spoke to my needs. So I left the church for good. I concluded that it was about power and control, money and sex. The church had not helped me to be successful in life. I decided to find my own spiritual path. I invested 20-some years in the church. It didn't work for me. Now I'm about elevating my own consciousness, finding my own inner truth and wisdom, and living from that place.
Ultimately, she said she found what she was looking for within her own self. Her story gives us much to explore. Scriptures were a part of her social construction of self and ultimately her reinvention of self. We begin now where she left off with the African Hebrew Israelites.
Usually when I talk about the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, I assume the audience doesn't know what I'm referring to. I think this might be a group that has some idea, so I'll try to do a quick thumbnail sketch of the organization and tell you a little bit about why I think someone like Cynthia would have been drawn to a group like this, and maybe the aspects of it that would have also repelled her. In 1967, Ben Ami, before that was named Ben Carter, was a bus driver in Chicago and a relatively young upstart in the Black Hebrew Israelite community in the U.S. And one thing most people, I don't think, give enough sort of serious consideration of is the extent to which various versions of institutionalized African American commitments to understandings of themselves as Jewish or Hebrew have a long tradition, going back at least into the early 19th century, and in some ways even before. Now, Ben Carter was a young upstart in '67, and he took a group of about 400 African Americans with him to Liberia. And it was a tragic failure in some ways. They weren't prepared for what emigration would demand. And by 1968, 3/4 of those folks had come back to the States, dejected, miserable, unhappy. And it looked like his immigrationist project was doomed to failure. At that point, however, he got what was then his second visitation from God, his second amount of divine intervention. The first time was Angel Gabriel in 1967, telling him, don't worry about what the elders are saying in the community. Take my people out of the wilderness of 1967 America. In '68, the second piece of divine intervention was voiced by way of Martin Luther King Jr. At least that's how he tells the story. King's famous speech of seeing the promised land in a vision. And for Ben Ami, what that meant was they didn't belong in Liberia to begin with. That they shouldn't have thought of Liberia as the place where they could forge what was really, in Anthony Wallace's sense, a revitalization movement from the ground up. So they left Liberia in 1968 and hobbled by 1969 to what they call Northeast Africa, which is the southern half of the modern state of Israel in the Negev. And they've been there ever since. So this is their 40th year. Now, part of what, I'll say 4 quick things about the group before I sit down and let Velma come back up with the context. The first thing that becomes really important as a way to think about what's, I think, interesting about this organization's commitment to a different form of spirituality is the degree to which they're trying to find a way to think about Africanness and Hebrewness as one and the same thing, which for me was a different model of Black Hebrew identity than I had come to know. My second book, which was based in New York City, looked at a different branch of the Black Hebrew Israelite tree, a group in New York City, that actually understood Africans to be different peoples, right? Africans were Hamites, they were Hagarenes, they were Cushites, they were Ishmaelites, but they weren't Israelites. And that difference for them made a fundamental difference to them, right? They had a revisionist history of the transatlantic slave trade. All that was pagan Africans and Arab Muslims selling Black Hebrews into slavery. Anything else is a line of falsification, according to the group in New York City that I studied in the 1990s. So part of what it meant was they had a diaspora, but it wasn't in any way, shape, or form an African diaspora, right? It was, in some ways, a New World's indigenous diaspora that connected West Indians, African Americans, Haitians to indigenous populations throughout the Americas and disqualified Africans from belonging. Right? So I just thought that was interesting because that came in conjunction with a quite rabid, I thought, and impressive Black nationalist philosophy. But a Black nationalism without recourse to Africa, not genealogically, not genetically, and certainly not symbolically. So that was interesting. Now, the only reason I even found out about the group in Israel was because doing research with this organization in New York meant hearing them constantly rail against Ben Ami and the group in Dimona. Right? And part of the reason why they did that was because the group in Dimona really wants to understand and reckon Hebrew Israelite identity as being part and parcel of what it means to think about yourself as African. So once they began to build a community in Israel, they renamed themselves the African Hebrews of Jerusalem. Right? So already you see they're not in conversation with the group in New York City. At the very same time, for them, it was about re-geographizing the entire region. So the Middle East, conspiratorial fiction, their argument goes. And Israel is and always was Northeast Africa. And they have a wonderful way of looking at all the various forms of Hebrewism that you can find throughout the continent of Africa, which for them is an instantiation, evidentiary grounding for their claims about originality. When I think about Ben Ami and the Hebrew Israelites, I try to maybe think about 4 key areas that they allow us to reimagine as scholars of religion that become very interesting. One is their incredibly sophisticated mobilization of new media technology in every way you can imagine. So the group is in Israel, and what was once at one point 100 people is now somewhere around 3,500. And that's just in Israel and all throughout Israel, not just Dimona. But they're also on 4 continents. Right? So they're able to somehow keep together a spiritual diaspora, a transnational spiritual community all over the world. And they do this in every way we might imagine they'd have to in the contemporary 21st century moment. With every manner of new cell phone technology, YouTube, internet, DVD, they stream everything. It's a kind of mass-mediated form of spiritual subjectivity that allows them to communicate with satellite communities all around the world by way of their production of these new media offerings. And one thing you can do if you want is when you go home, just go on YouTube, and you'll see tons of their work up on YouTube. Not just their cosmology and philosophy and political orientation, but also their representations of their cultural practices. They also, I think, have a wonderful revisionist commitment to the Bible and its various forms of literal validity. For them, it's not about the story of Ham as the origin story for racialized difference. It's a story of Jacob and Esau, right? That for them becomes sort of the founding of racial differentiation, and also the explanation for how they come to make sense of African America's position in the world, and why African Americans and African peoples throughout the New World have a special kind of covenant with Yah. The third really wonderful area, I think, of their kind of counter-hegemonic reading of the source of spiritual beliefs they grew up in various forms of Christianity and Islam in the States, is the work they do with the notion of the Messiah, with the Mashiach. And for them, Jesus, Yeshua, is certainly a Messiah. But the emphasis is on the indefinite article, a Messiah. Ben Ami is another Messiah, they would argue. They tell you Harriet Tubman is a Messiah. Certainly Martin Luther King, a Messiah, anointed by God to lead God's people. For them, it's a way to try to think about all of the ways in which they've come to understand the truthfulness of the Bible without what they would imagine is the kind of irrationality and absurdity of organized Christian dogma wrapped around it. So the whole story of Yeshua's Immaculate Conception is laughable, they would argue, right? Clearly there are ways to make sense of that narrative that don't have to have recourse to that sort of flight of fancy. So it's a kind of de-exceptionalization of Yeshua, an attempt to tell the story of their own investments in spirituality by way of some of the canonical leaders of African American and various forms of sort of political activist communities around the world. And so the fourth part of their sort of larger political and social project that's important, in some ways maybe the most important, is that they are fascistically healthy. The entire community is vegan by fiat, by mandate. That wasn't always the case. They had to sort of evolve to a form of veganism. One of the ways in which they sustain this spiritual community is by way of an international network of soul food vegan restaurants. And we have quite a few in the States. And already you should think soul food vegan, that's hard to pull off. But I think they do it quite well. And they have quality control that I think a transnational company like McDonald's would be quite proud of. So it tastes the same in Jerusalem as it does in Dimona, as it does in Chicago, as it does in Atlanta. And often, even for a meat eater like me, I'm an anthropologist, I have to eat everything, I tell people. Occupational requirement. The veganism is still quite edible. And for them, the use of the media technology, their sense of what's important about their project is linked to this notion of a covenant with God, before the fall, right? So this veganism for them is a reading of the Bible, not the Bible of Exodus, right? And the kind of concessions in some ways Yah is making to an already fallen people, but a prelapsarian moment in the Garden of Eden. That for them becomes the diet of choice for God. Now, what I wanted to do really quickly is to play just about 6 minutes of an interview with their Minister of Information. Because I think one thing he is able to do is give you a sense of, one, their revisionist historiography, and two, some of the ways in which they think about a kind of reclamation of the Bible as sacred text in a way that meshes with their particular understanding of African Americans and their historical trajectory. So maybe just, hopefully the sound is okay on it.
Practice. Those cultural practices can be documented to this day. Language patterns, name similarities, circumcision, marriage rights, separation of women during menstrual cycle, separation of the women from the household after childbirth for a certain number of days prescribed to biblical culture. They're called Hebrewisms. There was an Englishman in 1930 who wrote a book called Hebrewisms of West Africa, where he documents among the Ashanti, the Ewe, the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Ga, and other West African peoples. He documents that there are Hebrew cultural patterns and similarities to the ancient Israelites in West Africa. So then what took place in West Africa? In West Africa was the site of the great slave trade. So if you think about the fact that there were some people who were already living there, and here come some newcomers who, after 1,000 to 1,400 years of migration, arrive in West Africa at approximately the same time that you have handfuls of Europeans rowing ashore from their boats in the harbors to carry away millions of our people. Do you think that they single-handedly were able to do that? That the brothers and sisters didn't rally and come to the assistance and aid of African people? There was collaboration on the part of Africans with the European slavers. And who do you think they would then go into the interior and bring back to sell, except a newcomer, someone who had recently arrived and was considered to be an outsider, someone who had brought some different cultural practices, and this is all documented. If we look in the Western Hemisphere, we look at the embarkation points or the disembarkation points, we find that in South America, take Brazil, they practice what's called Santeria. Santeria has Yoruba roots, with a thin layer of Portuguese Christianity as an icing. But the cake is Yoruba. So then you go to the Yoruba, you go back into Nigeria, you look at the Yoruba culture. The Yoruba say that they are descendants of, guess where? Israel. They have a totem pole called the Staff of Orion. It's a huge monolith that's over 1,000 years old, and at the top of it there's this Hebrew letter, Yud. The Hebrew letter Yud is the first letter in the name of the God of Israel. It's how you get the Y sound, Yah, hallelujah. Second stop in the slave trade, Caribbean. Where did Bob Marley get the idea to sing Exodus? You know, where did all these connections come from in the Rastafarian culture back to His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie in Ethiopia, which he didn't stop there because he was the descendant of the union of the Queen of Sheba and that union between Solomon, King Solomon, and the Queen of Sheba. So again, there's this cultural thread that comes back through West Africa, back to Northeast Africa, back to Israel. The third stop, in America, we were forbidden to read, write, preach, or teach, punishable by death in many instances.
Absolutely. Capital punishment.
Capital punishment. Now, our ancestors, being wise, knowing we've seen roots, being wise, how did they keep alive that cultural remembrance? Through song. In the fields, what did we sing about? Did we sing about the River Niger, the River Gambia, the River Volta, the River Zambezi? We sang about the River Jordan. Did we sing about Mali, Songhai, Timbuktu? No, we sang about Jericho, Jerusalem, and Canaan's land. Now, there are those that would say, oh, well, we got that from missionaries, because the missionaries taught us, the first European missionaries, they came and they brought us their doctrine and the Bible, and that was our first exposure to the Bible. That's not true. documented right here by a man named Mungo Park. What's this? Mungo Park, I don't know. I will paraphrase a little bit here. Just by the way, this is text from an exhibition that I have. The exhibition that I was telling you about. John Lovell Jr., Black Song, The Forge and the Flame, pages 31, 32. If the American white man fancies that he was the first to teach the Bible to his black slave, he is quite mistaken. Mungo Park, a Scottish explorer, as affirmed by Marion Starkey, found the Phantom of the Kaffir. Y'all know what the Kaffir is. Kaffir is that South African, that Dutch term, if I'm not mistaken. Another person. The Kaffir schoolmaster had Arabic versions of the Pentateuch, which are the first 5 books of the Bible, all right? The Psalms of David and the book of Isaiah. Now, the Bible as we know it today is a collection of books. The Bible was not always like it is today. It was handwritten in the ancient times. Why was it in Arabic? Well, it's a Hebrew text, because Arabic was the language of scholarship in West Africa because of the invasions of the Moors. And the invasions, that was the ruling language, so to speak, just like English is the ruling language in the world today. It is the language of the imperialist power. So you have this brother who's in possession of these Arabic copies of Hebrew text. He says the unlettered Mandingos entertained him with stories of Joseph and his brethren, Moses, David, and Solomon. They gave out the stories as part of their own folklore and were very much surprised to learn that white men had heard them. So our first exposure in the States, in wherever, to the Bible and the connection with being Hebrews and descendants of Israelites did not come via European missionaries. It was already part of our culture.
Hebrew singing gospel choir that tours the world. 3 quick sort of critiques to leave you with. One is clearly a critique of the way Christianity has codified a particular manifestation of the Bible as sacred text. And it's a critique that historicizes the text and tries to find a way to think more critically about the sorts of narratives they were given before they reverted to Hebrewism. So it's an Old Testament that they trust and read in Hebrew. It's a gospel that they're a little bit more suspicious of and read a little bit more darkly to kind of reconfigure Wimbushyan term. The gospel has to be interpreted. The gospel is a little problematic, they do include it, and the Apocrypha. So it's a sort of critique of the Bible as text, a critique clearly, most fundamentally, of America, American culture at large, and of Black American culture. So everything that they grew up in America is by definition pathological. Every aspect of American culture. And African Americans, the argument goes, are the canaries in that particular coal mine. Right? Everything we eat, everything we say, everything we think is an amped up manifestation of the pathological cultural framework that is the American perspective. And so for them, that's kind of the major point of departure. And the last thing is a critique of, in some ways, not just Christianity, but religiosity itself. And one of the things they'll tell you over and over again, what you saw here was Ahmadiyya Ben-Yehuda, the Minister of Information, talking to a group of visitors from the States. And they're constantly accepting visitors. They're amazing hosts. And they're very good with the process. So when you come, they'll take you all around Israel. They'll show you why your understanding of that region is completely erroneous. And then they'll sort of right the ship for you and let you know how African Americans have always been connected to this land. But for them, it's not just a critique of Christianity, it's a critique of religiosity itself and the sort of compartmentalized rubric that it allows for. So they will tell you adamantly, in all versions that I've seen thus far of Christian, of African American Hebrew identity in the States, have this similar sort of
aversion to a notion of religion as a framework for thinking about what it is they're doing. So they're anti-religion. Religion's the problem, they'll tell you. Christianity, Islam, Judaism, that's the problem. What they're doing isn't religion, it's culture, it's a cultural practice. And they would argue that difference makes the difference. It's the only thing that's going to save the region and the world.
So this radical story of separation and restoration, about the same time that this group of people were leaving Chicago and moving first to Liberia and then to Jerusalem to reinvent themselves, another group of people were leaving Chicago and New York City to move to South Carolina to reinvent themselves. And they also were focusing on culture. So this group became known as the Oyotunji African Village in Sheldon, South Carolina. And they wanted to establish a village where they say they could practice their traditional culture from West Africa insofar as possible. So they built temples and they built their living quarters styled after a West African village. They call the place Oyotunji, meaning the old kingdom of Oyo wakes up. Oyo rises again. So they established this village. This is over 30 years ago. And it's there, it's still there. One of the founders that I interviewed reported that he and a few other priests, when they first came, decided that they wanted to ritualize this nationalist ideology or philosophy that they were living by. And so they took the Bible, their Western clothes, and an American flag, and they performed this ritual of cleansing the aura, rubbing these items down over the body, and then throwing them in a steel drum and burning them. They said never to go back to this way again. So Oyotunji then has become a place where they celebrate African heritage. It's a place where people go for initiations and trainings, religious festivals, consultations, and readings. A reading consists of a diviner consulting the oracle through a cast of shells, palm nuts, a divining chain, and interpreting the Odu. The Odu is the Yoruba scripture, and they explain it like this. It provides a situational awareness of whatever is going on in your life. It's considered the voice of the gods, the Orisha. But the Orisha are also aspects of consciousness. Ori, the head. Orisha, selected heads. So in this whole concept then is very expansive. So the divinities are aspects of consciousness, and each person then in a reading is getting a personalized set of scriptures that speaks to the energy matrix that is operating within that person's life. So this is just a brief thumbnail sketch then of the Odu and how it functions as scripture. So what are we to make of these narratives then? We've heard narratives of quest and struggle, triumph and trauma, transformation and redemption, radical separation and revisionist history. Are they not a reading of responses to the psycho-political, historical, social circumstances within which and from which individuals and communities construct their meanings and self-understandings? From personal to public narrative, from individuals to communities, we find scriptures serving as source material for anchoring, holding, sustaining, and reconfiguring lives. At times with fierce rigidity, and at other times with total abandonment. Perhaps Barbara Holmes, theologian and scholar of religion, observation is relevant here. She suggests that At one point, the Black church knew how to collectively hold the people in a protective membrane of safety that offered a shield against communal oppression and individual angst. But this is no longer the case, she notes. And quoting cosmologist Brian Sweeney, she adds, "When we do not feel held, we create restrictions and rules to hold us and protect us from groundlessness." Is this one of the functions of African American scriptural readings? Has this reading of scripture also been a reading of America and one's social location in America? What about Cynthia's journey and her quest for absolute truth? What about the college and seminary students who embraced rigid literalist interpretations of the Bible? And the Muslim student who said, "So much about my faith tradition no longer makes sense to me, but I'm afraid to let it go." Why? Because I'm afraid I will be punished. I will be disconnected from my power source. But even so, I no longer read the Quran with the fervor I once had. What about the radical separation and revisionist projects of the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem and the founders of Oyotunji African Village? Did their ideologies grow out of a reading of America expressed through scripturalizing practices? I suggest that when we take away our holy figures and our sacred stories, what we find is the core self, but even that self is shaped by the cultural sources at hand, scriptures being one of those sources. In concluding, I want to return to a question that was posed in open discussion on yesterday. Could this business of scripture help us imagine a polycultural society? And in pondering an answer, I thought about Thomas Berry's quotation, and he says, "It's all a question of story." We are in trouble just now because we do not have a good story. We are in between stories. The old story, the account of how the world came to be and how we fit into it, is no longer effective. Our challenge is to create a new sense of what it means to be human. This is the lesson I think we learned from the history of African American engagements with scriptures. I recently applied for a New Mythos project grant. And on the website, the introduction says, "We humans are in search of a way to understand the patterns underlying the profound transformations we are currently experiencing in relationship with each other and our planet. From whence will this new mythos come? Who will tell the story?" I suggest that scholars of religion have a major role to play in the birthing of a new story, a story of a more just and equitable society. When one's worldview shifts to understand the interrelatedness of all life, one's ethics likewise will be affected to work for human justice and environmental sustainability. Who will tell the new story? Thank you.
Chance to sit down for a moment. First, if we could, I'd like for us to give a round of applause for the entire panel. They did a beautiful job. I personally would like to thank the Institute of Signifying Scriptures, particularly Dr. Wimbush, for inviting me out. I was just mentioning to him a minute ago that it's incredible to hear people researching and talking about things that I kind of think about, but I'm not used to hearing outside of my own head. So it's just, you know. But very quickly, I just wanted to very quickly say, I also felt that the session was aptly titled Scriptures as Sundials. To me, it references a couple of different things that I think I heard consistently throughout the three presentations, having to do with three different areas. Now, the sundial I thought was an appropriate metaphor, in that contrary to abstracted Western practices of time telling, the sundial is more immediately tied to the experience of measuring time, right? Directly tied to the sun, directly tied to the position of the earth and the rotation of it. You have a very experiential element to timekeeping that I thought was very appropriate to looking at African American practices in a particular way, particularly as it relates to time and space. Right? So in terms of space, we're dealing with the reimagining of diaspora, the reimagining of geography, very appropriate to that. And time, in relation to African American history, has always been a very interesting thing. When you look at practices, we don't have the same relationship to time as you might have in what I would call a hyper-chronological context. So, for example, if you're going to talk about slavery or the end of slavery, enslaved Africans didn't have the luxury of saying, well, the Emancipation Proclamation went through any day now, slavery's over. Well, on paper, that's what it sounded like, but the experience of it didn't function that way. So that in that sense, emancipation didn't reach everybody at the same time, and even when it did, you had to deal with the peonage system, you had to deal with re-imprisonment, you had to deal with various modes of reinstituting various forms of slavery. So the relationship to time as it constitutes experience is very interesting in the African American experience. Also with voting, for example. So 1870, we get the right to vote, but somehow in 1965, we still have to have the Voting Registration Act. And in 2004, people still can't vote in black communities, right? So the relationship to time as it relates to experience in African American context is a very interesting thing. So it's not a hyper-chronological thing, it's very experiential and must take a moment-to-moment, condition-to-condition standing rather than it's 3 o'clock, it's November 15th, these things are supposed to happen. And lastly, scripture as sundial definitely talks about story, improvisation, reorientation of route dogma, reinterpreting story in willful and agency-filled ways. So I thought the term, the metaphor, and of course the presentations brilliantly linked these divergent approaches to time, space, and story. And I was very excited to hear it. I almost forgot that I was supposed to come up here because I had a list of about 10 questions I was going to ask. So y'all better not slip because I got plenty. But anyway, we'd like to get started, and I got one hand already, and we will try not to have people talk over each other, so start with that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to the panel. My question is to John, and maybe you said part of this and I just didn't get it, but could you say a little bit more about the naming of the group? I think it's called African Hebrew Israelites, right? So I'm wondering specifically why both Hebrew and Israelites, for one. Then there's another type of question I'm wondering about. Are they there, this is on my way to the real question, are they there sort of as a critique of like America and colonialism? And so then what in that sort of mindset do they do with the indigenous Palestinians? I mean, I'm just wondering how they reconcile their presence in Palestine as a critique of, and then, I mean.
Those are both great questions. In terms of the first one, part of what I think becomes important to remember is that, their project is a project that really is predicated on an attempt to reimagine what it is to think about Africa's relationship to the New World. And so a lot of the decisions they make are decisions that they came to over time. So for them, Africa, Hebrew, Israelite, even American, all up for grabs, all need to be redefined also. They're very committed to redefinition. They call it the power to define. So for instance, because they're all eating healthy, because every day is a no-salt day, because they have mandatory colonics and exercise for all the members, they imagine that what they're putting into their body shouldn't be called a diet. A diet is what other people do because they eat to die, right? So they have a living because they eat to live, right? So there's all these ways in which it's about sort of reparsing. Hebrew is really a kind of catch-all term, right? So a lot of these groups, in their sort of reading of ancient history, a whole bunch of folks are Hebrew, right? A whole bunch of folks are Hebrew. Israelites are a very particular sliver of that larger Hebraic power. So that's why that distinction becomes important. So all the folks they're in conflict with
are Hebrew in a lot of ways, right? So Hebrew becomes a kind of catch-all term to do the work of getting down to the nitty-gritty of the specific relationship, the covenant-based relationship between a particular, the Israelites and God, means not sort of mixing that up with a larger notion of Hebrew. That's the reason why also they don't think about Judaism as the rubric they use to talk about who and what they are. For them, Judah is about a particular tribe, one of the 12 tribes. You can't use it to talk about Israelites in total, right? Israelites compose 12 tribes. So there are all these ways in which they're really constantly trying to push back against presuppositions around how these particular terminology sort of circulate in the world. And so the second question was the question about, remind me again?
It's about the Palestinians.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they have such an incredibly complicated relationship to the sort of geopolitical situation there. For the longest time, really, their position was, we are the true Hebrew Israelites, you are the false Jews of Revelation. We are home, you should leave. Right?
I'm sorry.
The Israelis. So,
okay.
and of course you can imagine it doesn't go over well, right? If you're trying to come in, under the auspices of the right of return. That's not the rhetoric anymore. The rhetoric is much more inclusive. Tribes went south, tribes went north. But they've always had this really interesting relationship to the sort of two sides of that battle. They're committed to the integrity of the Israeli state. They want to be citizens. They still don't have citizenship after 40 years. A few years ago, they finally got permanent residency, which meant that the Israeli government didn't conduct sting operations and export them when they tried to work illegally, because they couldn't work for the first 30 years they were in Israel. So they had to work off the books. And invariably, often the men would go out, try to build homes. The Israeli government would round them up and send them back to the States. And they'd find ways, they always got back. They found ways to get back. But they were building homes and other kinds of institutions for people like Palestinian activists and for African Bedouin. So there's substantive relationships, the on-the-ground relationships are with those communities, right? They're not necessarily with other Israelis. Even in the moment, they have good relations now, right? They're not seen as a threat. But their real strong ties are with folks on the other side of that particular divide. And one thing they did a couple years ago, and I'll stop on this note, is after they got permanent residency, which for them is just the kind of penultimate step before they finally do get citizenship, which they know is coming and already preordained, they volunteered their first cohort of high school graduates to serve in the military. So if you're a permanent resident, you don't have to do that.
In the Israeli?
In the Israeli army. And part of that's a gesture on their part to reciprocate, right? To say, we're glad we got permanent residency, we're going to show you our commitment. And I think part of what it does is it shows you just how sort of complicated their relationship is to that entire story. Recently, just 2 years ago, they opened up the Martin Luther King Jr. Conflict Resolution Center. So they're no longer necessarily trying to stay above the fray. Now they imagine they can be a community that brings the two sides together because of their commitments to Israel and because of their relationships, their long-standing relationship with African Muslims, Bedouin, and Palestinian activists. So now their project is to try to sort of be a mechanism for bringing these sides together and ending the war. But it's taken them a long time to get there.
We have a hand up there. I was still stuck on forced colonics. I'm sorry.
I think just to follow up on that, I was curious about the generations that were born maybe in Israel. Like, so if their parents moved over there, they're being volunteered into the army and whatnot. And what is sort of like the younger generations, like ascent or dissent to that community and their own religiosity?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't have a good answer except to say they're very good about keeping tabs on what's going on in the States. And so they're conscious of all the latest fads. They have critiques of them. They also find ways to reimagine them such that they're aligned with what they imagine to be a sort of more Yah-centered perspective. So the kids love hip-hop. They do all of that stuff. They speak 3 languages. They speak like they're from Chicago, even though they've never been to Chicago. But they have the accent. I mean, part of what the model is a model of authoritarian rule, right? It's Ben Ami's way or the highway, basically. And he still has this charismatic authority in a Bavarian sense that's quite palpable. So I've only met him in particular 3 or 4 times. But you can see why people, on the south side of Chicago sold stuff that they had and went with this dude to Liberia because it has a kind of energy, right, that these charismatic figures have. The young people follow the rules. If you don't, you leave. But when you leave, what's interesting often is you don't go to the States because you've never been to the States, right? You go to Tel Aviv, what they call Tel Aviv, right? or you go somewhere else in Israel. And invariably, often you'll find your way back. But until you do, you have to be cut off in a certain kind of way. And there's been this sort of complicated dance they do around folks who leave the community but stay in Israel. And still somehow, because they're African Americans in Israel, they represent the community even though they've in a way been excommunicated or, so, or let go. And so for them, young people often leave. Sometimes they come back. Usually when they leave, they just go to other parts of Israel and become a part of the multiracial landscape.
Mr. Jackson, I heard the word fascistically or fascism or something at the very beginning of your presentation, and I don't know the context and what you were talking about. Can you go back and tell me what that is? And if you can, it's all right, but it threw me.
No, and it was meant to throw you.
It was ironic or something?
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying that they're just incredibly healthy, and it's a healthiness by decree, by fiat, right? So the idea is, and all the stuff they're doing is, I think, incredibly good for you. I think even to a certain extent, maybe the colonics, but I mean, but the whole point is for them, it's really about the body as an instantiation of one's relationship to Yah. And that needs to be repaired. So when they talk about reparations, it's repairing your relationship with Yah, and that starts with repairing your body. Their end game ultimately is a kind of immortalist end game. So they believe the body can regenerate at a sort of cellular level into perpetuity. So if the old guard, the folks who are now 60 or 70, they figure they've done enough damage to their bodies, they maybe won't live forever. But if they can live in these bodies till 125, 150, folks will see, right, that this is a model for living. And actually a few years ago, maybe now actually more than like 20 years ago, a group of medical doctors from Vanderbilt and Meharry went and visited the group and tested all the senior citizens for hypertension, high blood pressure, the stuff that disproportionately affects black folks here, and found none of it. That for them was a victory. So this health component is exactly for them the centerpiece, and it means they are no nonsense about it and trying to get more and more invested in this health project. So they're all vegan, but they'd rather they were all raw food eaters. That would even be better, they think. So they're trying to get there. They're not there yet. So they're constantly evolving, but it is this commitment to health.
Thank you.
Well, over here, and then we also have this gentleman had his hand up a couple times. Yeah, this is your conference. I'm going to tell you no.
Were there others? Catch me off guard here. This is for Renee, but maybe Velma has a comment as well. I appreciated very much what I took to be a kind of friendly critique, maybe a kind of revisionist, feminist, womanist proposal in relationship to this sort of historical schema that I've worked on, which is not finished, and I'm inviting all of you all to work on it, the young at heart, so to speak. And so your reference to the slave narratives and what we do with those in relationship to the thesis about the onset of fundamentalism in the community. So I think I want to just invite you to help me, all of us continue working on this, but let me offer this as a response for the moment. So a couple of things. One, you should know that the director certainly knows, some of the associates, that I was, of course, interested in conceptualizing this whole conversation around fundamentalism at first. And I backed away from that because I thought we needed a lot more time to make the argument. Now, this is my thesis, not everybody else's necessarily, that in fact it's all of the scriptural religions that actually represent the onset of fundamentalism. That it is that we didn't want it to be seen as a peculiar registration on the part of peoples of color. In fact, I think it's the opposite, that, so you know my theory, that in fact the more American we try to become, the more fundamentalist. That's inherent in the scriptural religion. So you make a kind of comparative culture, comparative religions argument on that basis. The extent to which they're tied to written, to textedness, that problem is always there. Now, we weren't the ones, tied to that. We didn't just get up one cultural morning tied to text that way. It's because we had to sort of undergo how the West was playing itself out. Now, the reason I think the fundamentalism is belated among us is because in those earlier moments, first of all, those circles are interlocking. So, I tried to make that argument. But the reason I think that phenomenon is belated, whether it's 40s or 50s or not, but I think something around that time, in the sense that, you're having the beginning of sort of opening up with immigration, the schools, neighborhoods, just a whiff of that. And I think, religious culture, church culture may represent a lag, but that was part of it too. So what I think we need to do is to work more on a schematic that allows us to see a relationship between more investment in the dominant culture and fundamentalism. That this is not what we were suffering from or even playing with. Now, the final thing about the slave narratives then. So you could find some of this everywhere before that time, but I'm talking about a kind of dominant term, a major term. But folk like Morrison and others have taught us to be careful about slave narratives. These were kind of double-edged performances where she and others said they hid more than they revealed. So I think, we want to be careful. They might, they waxed biblical or scriptural in many respects, but that's just the beginning of the need to peel away what was, really at stake. So it's kind of, it was a particular kind of stylized performance that ought to be read very, very carefully with some nuance that is befitting the situation. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect
but I actually
sense.
want to invite you
Yeah.
to help advance this kind of schematic, and what you propose is very helpful, and I appreciate that.
And I'll respond in two streams to what you're posing, because for me, my ultimate concern is violence. And the anti-African, Euro-Christian world that we have adopted, the language world of that is violent. It is violent upon the souls, hearts, and minds of Black folks. And no matter how you get around that language world is existing in a stream of violence that is harmful to us as human beings. So part of the problem is, just by nature, for me, of adopting this kind of Christian identity, is saying that I'm buying into some form of violence. And so let me unpack this in terms of the way, in the way you address it. In terms of the slave narratives, I'm ever mindful that the slave narratives must be interpreted in light of a subjugated, American terroristic, lawful terroristic world. I'm also mindful that the slave narratives have to also be interpreted in light of the way in which they were used as veneers. The language world was sometimes function as a veneer to, in many ways, to offset what they were really articulating. But I think sometimes as scholars we use that a lot, and I'm not negating that reality is true. I'm saying that the significant numbers of this fundamentalist ideology in the 40s and 50s, I think you're on point because it's in significant numbers. But the reality, this ideology was existing in the narratives. It continues to exist in African American culture, and it's impacting how we see ourselves. It is an identity crisis that will forever impact us as long as we buy into this Christian, anti-African language world. And there's just no way, for me, in my scheme of seeing things, to get around that. So part of what I'm imagining is another space of, or an imaginary world of recreating the language. Now what that looks like and how that schema emerges, I'm not quite sure, but the language we have and we're using has not been helpful.
Okay, can I quickly say, if anyone else wants to respond, we only have a couple
Dr.
minutes.
Lomas.
Well, I just want to know, is there any language that, because what you're saying is that you're looking for some pure language.
I'm not looking, yes.
I don't know any culture that has that.
I agree.
Has ever done it.
I agree with you,
Or
Dr.
ever wanted to do
I
it.
agree with you, Dr. Long, but
Okay.
part of the problem is that we need to be honest about that, about the anti-African Euro-Christian language that has a lot of baggage for us as African
I
Americans.
got that, but we're talking about language now. We're talking about language as a human mode of communication, whether it's biblical, fundamentalist, Sanskrit, Hebrew, Yiddish, you name it. In other words, I'm wondering what you're looking for. If we're going to have human language, are you going to purge it immediately so that it doesn't have any violence in it before we can make use of it?
No, I don't think I'm not saying that's possible. What I'm promoting is a sense of exploring alternatives. We keep recycling the same language, and we're not going to ever we keep recycling the same Christian language. Part of my problem is the Christian enterprise for African Americans. Everything kind of situates itself. Even when we talk about Hebrew Israel, everything situates itself in this kind of Old Testament, New Testament paradigm. That is the problem.
Yeah, I can see that.
That is the problem. So that's what I'm struggling through. Now, I hear what you're saying, because language is always going to be a problem because it's a human construct.
But to go back to Benson's problem, it may be that that's the American problem. And the American problem, not so much with the Bible, but with something called the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
You see, so that you're asking for a lot of revolutionary reconstruction here. See, because it's not just the Bible that's involved in this kind of fundamentalism, authoritarianism, etc. You were enslaved legally, and your folks were enslaved legally because of the Constitution, not because of the Bible.
I agree. And part of what I tried to even show in the PowerPoint is the musing of that. The realities of and I call it a very legalistic American terrorist scene, created by law and by a text, a biblical text. And this is what we're operating out of.
But fight an equal battle with both sides, because the operative scripture here that you were worried about, that really works, that has power in the army, navy, and marines, is the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. I agree with that. But black folks on Sunday morning aren't, and they're not responding to the Constitution. They're responding to what Paul said.
Okay, very quickly, I've overlooked this gentleman 3 times. If we can get a very quick question, last response, we have a couple minutes left, we can end the session.
Okay. I was just curious about this really interesting group of people that we were just talking about, the African Israelites, and their concept of place and locale. And obviously it's very important to them, but I wonder now, since you say with technology and them using YouTube and cyberspace as perhaps creating a sacred space online, if this notion of place to them has been lessened in any way.
That's a good question. The quick answer is, I think there are other factors that force them to think about locatedness differently over the last 10 years. One of the most important ones being that in order for them to finally get permanent residency, they had to agree to no longer let any more African Americans permanently reside, sort of emigrate and come to the community. So folks can visit now, but you can no longer stay. And so part of what that means is that project becomes a project not of getting more folks to actually literally migrate to southern Israel, right? But it's about trying to find ways to create versions of their kifar, versions of their community all around the world.
And so they have one in Australia, in Europe, all throughout the States. Last time I was in Jamaica, they were about to create a community in Kingston, right? So the idea now is how to export their model throughout the world. They actually, the last thing I say, I mean, they're incredibly entrepreneurial. And so one of their biggest projects is a recreation of their kifar in Benin that cost them over $1.5 million. It's humongous, it's massive, right? And it was asked for by the Benin government. And there are other projects like that afoot in Ghana and Togo and other places. For them, it's about trying to find a way to reproduce what they've done there in that sacred space around the world, right? So they're exporting that.
Okay, I've been told we have time for one last question. I believe we had a hand over there.
I just wanted to ask you to maybe elaborate more on the Hebrew Israelite project around if we thought of reframing it from, so I appreciate your analysis, your nuanced analysis of their relationship to the Israeli state. But I would maybe want to add to it or ask you to see how to put it. Basically what I want to say is there's an asymmetry in the balance of powers between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And so calling it a conflict, I think on the one hand you're trying to show the nuances, but I think calling it a conflict isn't enough. And so I'd be interested to just hear you maybe elaborate more on I lost my train of thought because I thought we weren't going to ask another question, so I went to the break mode in my head. However, yeah, so that's pretty much the issue there. I think, I mean, by you know, even by participating in the military to whatever way, shape, or form, it's basically a military that's, whatever word we want to use, some people use the word genocide, that conducts massacres. The Goldstone report just talked about it as a war crime, which was a United Nations issued research findings. So I mean, what does that mean to this project? And that was pretty much an Andy had.
I just want to add that generally this is making me think about is that there seems like there's some capaciousness with how our communities are interacting with Christianity to maybe sometimes have a decolonizing project, but these decolonizing projects seem to be resting on the colonization of other groups that's either ignored or disavowed. And is that a limitation of Christianity such that we can't imagine a liberation that's not also dependent on the non-liberation of other peoples?
Yes, so I guess the point would be then, how does one kind of decolonization participate in the erasure of another group of people?
I don't know if you want a specific, I mean, it's a great question. It's some of what I think I'm trying to get the book to speak to. Saba Mahmoud and others have really pushed me on just this point. Your version of it almost sounds like the Baudrillardian critique of the Iraq War, right? It didn't happen because war doesn't do justice to the lopsidedness of what actually took place on the ground. War isn't what happened, conflict isn't the word. Not just to let myself off the hook, but one of the ways in which conflict becomes important for me is as a kind of vernacular term, right? So this is one thing, a word they use to talk about this struggle, they being the African Hebrews of Jerusalem. And so the Martin Luther King Center is a center about this conflict and interventions into this conflict. But I think you're right to say some of what's being trucked into this discourse, somewhat through the back door, are these sort of prefab categorizations of social difference that already have embedded in them these biased and subjectivized versions of reality that pass themselves off as objective truth. And I think it is in the language itself, but it's inescapable, but doesn't mean we can't continue to try to push back and critique even from within inside the belly of the beast or something. Thanks.
I wish we had more time. There was so much presented that I wish we had more time to more fully go through it. I just want to quickly say I appreciate all three, especially how you melded together the presentations. The visual component, I just wanted to quickly say, as somebody who grew up in a family with people that practiced from the Nation of Islam to Moorish Science Temple to, 5% Nation of Gods and Earths, to actually see that visual presentation include people that normally aren't a part of the visual memory of the African American community, it moved me. So I wish we had more time to get into some of those nuances, but I want to thank all three of you, and if we can give them one last applause.
Thank you, Hassan, for the work. announcement, just to remind you about the musical event tonight. This is not to be missed. Ernie Watts Jazz Quartet. We had to rearrange the order of these sessions. I looked again today to see what this means. I don't know how really otherwise to account for this, but that we had the panel on Native peoples in the morning, and then African Americans in the afternoon, and this evening Ernie Watts, who will bring us with his jazz quartet a blend of aspects of both those traditions. So it should be a wonderful event, not to be missed, and we hope to see you at Lyman Hall, 7:30, Pomona College, College Avenue and 4th Street. Thank you all very much.